All right, Bismillah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. So we have now reached session 4. And the attempt yesterday, just to briefly review, was to set the tone for the weekend, to talk about intentions, and to highlight the importance of companionship. Just in general, in terms of its both physical and psychological benefits, but really those are a given if you have the religious dimension, everything is put in its proper place, but they're important to note. But then also to, as Imam al-Ghazali frames it for those who were not here last night, is that ultimately companionship is a blessing from Allah. And one of the beautiful reflections this morning was on the verse that was quoted yesterday. And that how that in that very verse, that it is emphasized multiple times. And I want to share that for those who were not with us today. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. That and remember the blessing of Allah upon you. So there's a mention of that it being from Allah. إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً is that you were previously enemies. فَأَلَّفَ Allah ascribes the action to himself here. فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. And so that he that reconciled your hearts. He brought your hearts together. He united your hearts. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ. And again, the third, the indication here, that you became, through his blessing, because he could have just said, فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ إِخْوَانًا. You became brothers. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ to emphasize بِنِعْمَةِ إِخْوَانًا. And then even beyond that, وَكُنْتُمْ عَلَى شَفَا حُفْرَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ. You were on the precipice of a pit of fire. فَأَنْقَذَكُمْ مِنْهَا. So not only did you that something good come as a result of the way that you were, but also you were spared what you would have been like were it not to be from this blessing from Allah Ta'ala, which is an amazing blessing. And so that this really is an opportunity for us to approach companionship in a way that someone can achieve great blessings from Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And it seems on one hand something so easy to do. And on the other hand, the way of the shaitan is to get in the way of these incredibly great opportunities. And this is what shaitan, there's nothing that shaitan likes more than to incite problems between people. That tahrish, to create enmity, to that lead people to have grudges in their hearts against people. Hasad, right? Envy that turns into rancor. It even begins before that with ghadab. Shaitan's nature is fire. And anger is that if it's not righteous indignation, if it's anger for the nafs, is that it shares in that fire-like nature, but then that if someone does not that unleash their anger, then that it turns into rancor. And then that rancor, a'udhu billah, then turns into a whole long list of that other types of diseases, including envy, a'udhu billah, and shamata, where you want people to be injured and hurt, and you take joy in people's tribulations, a'udhu billah. This is all from the shaitan. And shaitan knows very well. He knows very well about how important it is for us to unite as an ummah. And the good that can come from a family uniting, that even two people uniting, that a husband and a wife, two spouses uniting, that people that loving each other for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, that a community uniting, let alone the ummah as a whole. And one of the things that we hope with everything that is happening now to our dear brothers and sisters that in Palestine is that this will be a source for the unification of the ummah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where we can put aside that these sectarian divides. We can put aside the egotistical aspect of this and come together for a cause that everybody who has even the least bit of sense in common decency knows that there's right and there's wrong right before their eyes. So in this session, after the previous session, that relates to the traits to look for in a companion, and the only thing that I wanted to mention there is, if it wasn't said, is that these traits that we are looking for in a companion are also the traits that you and I need to learn how to have in relation to the companion that we need to be. So just as that we want to look for those that in companions, that we also want to be that way to our companions. Is that we want to be people of intellect, we want to be people of good character, we want to be upright in of ourselves. And that when we do that, this is what allows these relationships to thrive, is that you and I can have good relationships that are that built upon proper foundations. So in this section that we're going to be looking at, that what are now the duties that you and I have towards companions. And the Imam Ghazali lists 8 duties. And the way that he prefaces this is about establishing what's called the act of ukhuwah. And that an act is a relationship, just as you have like an act of nikah, is that marry two people. And that we know that our Prophet ﷺ did this. And when I was researching this, if you just put into something like Maktaba Shamila, Akha Rasulallah. Right, so an akh is your brother. Akha is the act of setting people up to be brothers. And now this is more than just the innamal mu'minun ikhwa. Indeed, the believers are that brothers. This is a special type of ukhuwah. And that this is something that is well known in the sacred law, is that you do not have to make yourself do certain things that are of a praiseworthy nature, but you can also make it binding upon yourself if you wish. And that on one hand, that you need to be careful, because once you make something binding upon yourself, what was previously recommended or even permissible has now become an obligation. So in other words, is that when it comes to just doing anything, let's just say that you want to fast 3 days out of the month. This is something that is recommended, but if you make a nadhr, a vow to do that, then it becomes an obligation for you to fulfill your vow. And in a similar sense, when it comes to brotherhood, is that it's good to not only give everybody the right as a believer, but also to establish a strong connection with brothers, and this is men with other men and women with other women, for the sake of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. But if you establish what is called ukhuwa khasa, where that you in a sense take a vow to fulfill the rights of brotherhood, this is another degree. And again, you have to be careful to do this, because that you don't want to do this if you feel that you're fall short. In general, it's better to not make something binding upon yourself that Allah Ta'ala has not made binding. But there are a few people that have spiritual strength and high aspiration that might do this. And so that this is the context of these 8 rights, is that if there's an act of ukhuwah, is that if we want a special brotherhood with another individual, and we're not going to get into the language language wars. When we say brotherhood, it's obviously implied by that sisterhood. And we don't need to say anything more about that. Anyone who has a problem with that has a problem with biology and the XX and the XY chromosomes, so we'll just leave that aside. When you say man in the English language, it includes the female. And that even in Arabic, if you say طَلَبَ الْفَرِيدُةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ Muslim, even though there is a narration, Muslima, the more authentic narration is Muslim, and that obviously includes the female. So we don't need to say anything more about that. So when we talk about establishing brotherhood, and that there are certain duties that arise as a result. So he says, أَنَّ عَقْدُ الْأُخْوَةِ رَابِطَةٌ بَيْنَ الشَّخْصَيْنِ, is that establishing a brotherhood means that you're establishing a connection between two people. كَعَقْدِ النِّكَاحِ بَيْنَ الزَّوْجَيْنِ, and it's similar to establishing a connection between two spouses. And that before that you say that essentially what is a verbal transaction is that they are not able to be alone, but once the mahram of the lady that says that I marry you to, mentioning his daughter or the one that he's in charge of, and then there is ijab and qabul, and then it's accepted. Now, khalas, there is a marital relationship that has that certain conditions, there's certain rights, and there it is very different than moments before that, before this was established. And so he says, just as nikah, marriage, yaqtadi hukukan, it necessitates certain rights, yajibu al-wafa'u biha, is that it is obligatory for someone to uphold. He says that likewise, and this is mentioned of course in the Kitab of Adab al-Nikah, this is also the case if we're going to establish a special brotherhood. And he's going to mention what those are. And this is still helpful even if we don't have a particular individual necessarily, that we are saying that, okay, I have this degree of a relationship with them, but it's also something that we should look for. There might be people that we move up in degrees of connection to, and then we benefit greatly from that connection. And again, if you think about the wisdom of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we speak about this very generally, and personally I haven't seen an in-depth study, but I would love to see someone trace the different narrations to see that all what we know from the various companions that became that special brothers with others. Some of them we know, but if we would look in the books of hadith, and I'm not just talking about the Sihah Sitta, you expand to get to some of the much longer works of hadith, is that you will find amazing things, especially if you also got into the tarajim, right? Because you're not building any legal ruling off this, so you could get into the books of seerah, you could also get into the tarajim and the biographical tradition into see. And then you could find really amazing things. When we recently visited Sayyidina Mu'adh bin Jabal in northern modern-day Jordan, northwest of Irbid in modern-day Jordan, and we were reading a little bit about him and about the differences of opinion about who was it that our Prophet ﷺ set him up with a brother as. And one opinion is that it was Sayyidina, that Ja'far is that the cousin of our Prophet ﷺ. And that there's amazing things that are there if we look a little bit deeper. And we know on the surface level some of the levels of sacrifice that took place, is that when this happened. And you have beautiful stories of Salman and Abu Darda and conversations that transpired between them, and that things that happened because that they were considered to be brothers. So these are very important things that if we don't consider these matters, then we're just talking at a very surface level and there's no reality. And this is, if we go back to the introduction of what he says, Hujjat al-Islam, is that he says is that he calls it the afdal al-qurubat, loving for the sake of Allah and establishing a brotherhood in his religion is from the greatest of acts of devotion. And that from the greatest things that we can do to draw near to Allah Ta'ala, but he says it has shurut, it has conditions. And in order to reach the degree of merit that Allah says for those who are companions for the sake of Allah and reach that exalted degree of being those who love each other for Allah's sake, is that you have to fulfill these conditions. وَفِيهَا حُقُوق, there are rights. بِمُرَاعَاتِهَا, when you fulfill them, تَصْفُ الْأُخُوَةِ. Look at the way he frames this. Is that your brotherhood becomes pure. And شَوَائِبِ الْكُرَرَاتِ, from all of these blemishes, وَنَزَغَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, and the various promptings of shaitan. So, فَبِالْقِيَامِ بِحُقُوقِهِ, if we can uphold these rights, يُتَقَرَّبِ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى زُلْفَى, is that you will draw extremely close to Allah. وَبِالْمُحَاثَةِ فَحَافَظَ عَلَيْهَا, and if you can maintain them, تُنَادِ الدَّرَجَاتِ الْعُلَى, and that you will attain the highest of degrees. So this is why this is so important. And again, one of the things that he then goes on to mention right there in chapter 1, and this is right in the beginning where he talks about the fadila, the virtue of ulfa, of affinity, and ukhuwa, brotherhood. He says, ulfa, affinity, is thamaratu husnul khuluq. It is the fruit of good character. What tafarruq, and that divisiveness, dissension, that remaining divided, thamaratu su'ul khuluq, that this is the fruit of bad character. Good character brings about at-tahab, loving one another, wat-ta'aluf, having affinity with us, wat-tawafuq, and that agreeability. Wa su'ul khuluq, bad character, what does it give fruit to? At-tabaghud, mutual hatred, wat-tahasud, mutual envy, wat-tadabur, which is a type of like contempt and disagreeability, where you're just contrarian. So again, if we put all of these parts together, because the Ihya is a very systematic book, what is essentially the definition of good character? Is the inability of an individual to withstand the thought of shaitan or the thought of the nafs. And what is meant by withstand here is that when shaitan whispers, you lack the ability to either recognize it's from shaitan, or that if you recognize that it's from shaitan, to refrain from acting upon it. Or that if there's a thought from the nafs, is that you lack the ability to either recognize that it's from the nafs, or you don't think about it altogether, or that you recognize it as from the nafs, but you don't have the ability to stand up against it. That's the essence of what bad character is. Every single manifestation of bad character ultimately relates to thoughts that we have specifically from shaitan and from the nafs. And shaitan works with his greatest spy in kha'in, that traitor from within, which is the nafs. This is the whole story. And it's taking place in our heart constantly. A classic example of that would be is that if there's a situation where you should give your money out in general, or because of the dictates, and this is the first haqq that we'll speak about, is wealth. Is it where you should give your wealth out in a certain situation. But then, is that your nafs doesn't want to give that wealth out. So you have a prompting of the nafs not to give it out. And then, how are we before that thought? Do we recognize that and be like, no, that's from the nafs, that's not the way I should be, I'm giving my wealth out. But then you see where there's layers here. Then shaitan comes in, ya'idukum al-faqr, and then he promises you poverty. If you give this out now, then what's going to happen? Kada, kada. If you need it for this circumstance, wahakada. And then if we're weak before those thoughts, then our hadith an-nafs, our inner speech, starts to come in, where we try to find ways to reconcile these thoughts and to maybe that weasel out of actually giving that wealth when we know very well that we should give it out. And this is because we're da'if. We're weak before our thoughts. Whereas that if someone is strong, then they'll have the ability to curb that thought of the nafs. In immediate comes the heart, no, I need to give out intalam. And they'll wasari'u, that ila maghfirati min rabbikum wa jannatin arduha as-samawati, yani that you hasten to do good. that, and again, there's a difference between that musara'a and between ajala. That at-ta'anni min ar-Rahman wa al-ajal min ash-shaytan. At-ta'anni is a beautiful word. You can translate it as like deliberation. It's from the All-Merciful. And the root word ana ya'ni relates to picking fruits at the right time. And so you want to just wait. If you pick the fruit too early, it's not going to be ripe enough. If you wait too long, it's going to be spoiled. You want to pick fruits right at the right time and consume them right at the right time. So ta'anni, doing things at the right time, is from the All-Merciful. And at ajala, haste in the negative sense, so you have negative haste and you have good haste, if we're going to use the same English word for it, is that negative haste is doing things too quickly outside of their time. But musara'a, which is a good haste, is quickening to do them in their time. One is blameworthy and the other is praiseworthy. And we have to put everything in its proper place. So the whole point of me going into this tangent before we get into these duties is to talk about the importance of character and how in so many cases this gets back to our integrity as individuals, and specifically our ability to be able to sift through the various thoughts that come to our heart on a regular basis, and to make sure is that we are understanding them and acting upon them in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we cannot do this if we're not people of character. And again, we live in a time that there's a number of characteristics of our time, but we live in a time where people are becoming less and less resilient. They're becoming more and more flimsy and plastic-like, where they lack the integrity, where they lacked many of these great traits that their own parents might have had, let alone their grandparents or people that came before them. And even in this country, there was a time that there was just certain things that people didn't do. And we'll be speaking about this because the Arab have what is called, and this is a traditional understanding, but it's also that in Islam, is what's called the Kareem and the La'im. In traditional Jahili culture, one of the worst things that anyone could ever say to you is that you were La'im. That's the opposite of Kareem. Kareem is generous, of course, because this is one of the root important characteristics, but it's also nobility and all of these other great traits that were there in the Jahili period, which then that were incorporated into an Islamic that understanding. And this is one of the reasons why Allah chose the Arab to be the immediate people who are around the best of His creation, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, our Prophet Muhammad, because of these great traits that they had. In Jahili, it was used in a Jahili context, but then is that through the blessing of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that it took on religious meaning, and that this is the meaning of, one of the meanings of, the best of you in Jahiliyyah, the best of you in Islam, إِذَا فَقَهُ, if you truly understand. One dimension of that is, i.e., you allow that virtue to appear in the solely Islamic context solely for the sake of Allah Ta'ala. This is when you will experience its efficacy, about which Imam al-Ghazali says every trait of character ultimately opens up a door of closeness between us and Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The La'im is the opposite. This is the one who's unprincipled. This is the one who blows with the wind. This is the one that allows the ego to get the best of him, that cheats and that is two-faced, and that basically wherever the maslahah and benefit is that he goes. And he tends to be that bakhil and that miserly and essentially ignoble, the opposite of kareem. So in order for us to really have companions, we have to have traits. And this is important recognition, is that when we, again, speak of what we're looking at other people, we have to make sure that those traits, first and foremost, are in ourselves. Because one of the great ways to tell where we're at in our deen is to look at the people that are around us. Because of the secret of what Imam al-Ghazali pointed to, and we spoke about this yesterday, of this munasaba, this very subtle, that affinity that happens within the soul that comes from the nature of the ruh and then has layers beyond that. And that then you get to temperament, then you get to personality and all of these other different things. But it lies dormant from the depth of our being. And he says ultimately much of that we don't know. But that there's a reason why certain people are attracted one to another. And al-maru ala dini khalili, you are essentially on the religion of your closest friends. So in other words, if you are a certain way, you're going to draw certain people to yourself by the nature of how you are. And so the more that you and I try to have these characteristics, the more naturally that we're going to draw a certain type of people. Because people that have these characteristics are not going to necessarily, for the most part, incline towards other people that have different degrees of them in them. So we're going to cover 4 in this particular session. And that the chapter title here is في حقوق الأخوة والصحبة. Hukuk literally are rights. We felt duties was a better way to translate this. Because if you look at the definition of a duty, it's that moral or legal obligation, or you could say a responsibility. Is that if you look at the word right, it tends to incline more towards the legal, that aspect of that, at least in English, that a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way. And so even though you could speak of hukuk as rights in a general sense, there's nothing wrong with that. But really what Imam al-Ghazali is saying here is these are more duties. These are more duties. And in other words, that if you're going to uphold a special form of brotherhood with another individual, these are the traits that you're going to need. And so he lists 8. And so you have them there in your outlines. And the first is fil mal. We've translated that as financial assistance. The second relates to that personal assistance, and that this is the idea of qada al-hajat, where that you are helping fulfill people's needs, but literally al-i'ana bin nafs. So you're helping them with your wealth, but you're also helping them with your own self, doing various things for them. And then the third and the fourth relate to the tongue. The third is the things that you shouldn't say. The fourth is essentially the things that you should say. So guarding the tongue when needed, when it needs to be guarded, and then speaking that when beneficial. And then the next 4 that Amjad will cover in the first afternoon session: forgiveness, dua, supplication, wala and ikhlas, loyalty and sincerity, and then that tark at-takalluf, which we've translated as informality, is that just not going to excesses in terms of how we that approach that matters. So the very first one that he mentions is mal, and he begins by quoting the hadith that's already been said to you about the meaning of the likeness of 2 brothers are like 2 hands. One of them washes the other. And he says here is that our Prophet ﷺ likened brothers to 2 hands, because, and not a hand and a foot, he says, because is that they work together for a common purpose. فكذا الإخوان إنما تتم أخوتهما إذا توافقا في مقصد واحد. Is that their brotherhood becomes complete, 2 brothers that is, as that if they're working towards a common goal. And فهما من وجه كالشخص الواحد. So from one perspective, they're like one individual. They're 2 separate people, but they're like one individual. And one of the really ajib saying, Imam al-Ghazali actually mentions the story. There is that line of poetry that says, Ana man ahwa wa man ahwa ana. I am the one who I love, and the one whom I love is I. Nahnu ruhani halalna badana. We are 2 spirits in one body. And someone can reach a level of brotherhood, And he actually mentions this, where is that one brother said, is that because of the degree of my brotherhood with another individual, that إني لألقم لقمة أخ من إخواني فأجد طعمها في حلقي. This is said by Abu Sulaiman al-Darani. Is that I will give one of my brothers that a bite to eat, and that I will find its taste in my own throat. In other words, as if that I've eaten it. And these things are possible. And from the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the spiritual connection can be so deep, is that you actually that benefit in even this physical way from that. Now these are rarer occurrences. These don't happen every day. But it is important to open up this door in general with how we are with Muslims also. And that's actually going to be the object of reflection tomorrow morning, is the hadith of our Prophet ﷺ about Muslims being one body and what that means. The more that you and I that ascend spiritually, the more that we feel the reality of the pain of the ummah in a very real way. In a very, very real way. And the higher someone moves up in the hierarchy of the awliya, the more that they bear on behalf of the ummah. And sometimes that even affects them physically. This is very real. And if you've been around righteous people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is one of their great jobs, is to bear on the behalf of other people. And Imam al-Sha'rani used to mention that he used to have a wird of tahseen, seeking protection for himself, his family, that his close friends, his neighbors, the people of his city, the people of his locale, and then for all Muslims. He would actually have regular awrad of asking Allah for protection for the various groups of people. And that the true people of Allah Ta'ala are the ones who are most in tune with that statement of our Prophet ﷺ, that experience what it means to be one body. And what a metaphor. There's so many different meanings to that blessed hadith of our Prophet ﷺ. So he says here, when it comes to wealth and financial assistance, there are 3 degrees. So I'm just going to translate to the best of my ability what he says. No claims are being made. I'm the worst of all you and the most in need of all of this. So I'm just a translator, and we're reading this as brothers in hopes that we can do better and to resemble, or at least die trying to resemble, the true people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that know what sacrifice really is. We don't know what sacrifice is. Is that oftentimes that our portion is just the laqalaqat al-lisan, we're just moving our tongue. But may Allah Ta'ala not make that our only portion. May we try to resemble these people to the best of our ability. So he says, adnaha, the least degree is the following. In tunziluhu manzilata khadimak, is that you deal with your brother the day that you would deal, way you would deal with someone who's working for you, literally your servant. So, فَتَقُومَ بِحَاجَةِ مِنْ فَضْلِ مَالِكَ, if you have extra wealth, is that you take care of his needs. فَإِذَا سَنَحَتْ لَهُ حَاجَةً, if a need of his arises, وَكَانَتْ عَنْدَكَ فَضْلَةٌ مِنْ عَلَى حَاجَتِكَ, and you have more than what it is that you need, أَعْطَيْتُ ابْتِدَاءً, أَعْطَيْتُهُ ابْتِدَاءً وَلَمْ تُحْوِجْهُ إِلَى السَّوَالِ, that you give to him without him asking. فَإِنْ أَحْوَجْتُ إِلَى السَّوَالِ, if you force him to ask you for it, فَهُوَ غَايَةَ التَّقْصِيرِ فِي حَقِّ الْأُخُوَّةِ. So most of us, khalas, all of our relationships are gone. Is that this is the highest degree of falling short in the right of brotherhood, if you make them ask. But if you really pause here and look at this, regardless of how this was actually implemented throughout history, look at what we're being called to. And one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard is that one of our teachers, and someone I met, Habib al-Qadir bin Ahmed al-Saqaf, is that the people witnessed this that were right around one time that a businessman brought him 1 million Saudi riyals in a bag. Plop, brought him 1 million Saudi riyals. And the people that were around him described what happened after that. He gets in the car, and this is around Asr time, and they didn't finish until after Isha. And he starts telling the driver where to go, and he's living in Jeddah. And he's saying to go to this house, and he goes to this house, and they deliver something. Go to this house, and and he went to all of these different homes until at night he holds the bag upside down. He says, Allahumma fashhad. Oh Allah, bear witness. Right? He didn't keep that single riyal for his own family. He saw this as Allah gave him that money, and he had the responsibility of distributing it. If you and I, a million riyals is like, what, $330,000? That's a lot of money. You would think, like, okay, I'm going to keep like a good portion of that and just give a little bit out, after that. But the point here being in the shahid of the story is that he knew where all the poor people's homes were. He was in touch with the people. And some of the more modern biographies of the righteous tend to focus on the social dimension, almost in the senses that they critical of the previous biographies that tended to focus more upon the karamat. But this was a given that they were involved in their societies. They were intimately connected to their societies. They were among the people and accessible to their people to the highest possible degree. That they were connected to their societies fully. They knew people's states. They knew what they were going through. They knew what they needed. There was this incredible interconnectedness. And this is what you and I need to revive to the extent possible. And wherever it is that we're living, with whoever is willing to have us do that with. This is essential. Because this is what makes people suffer when this goes. So anyhow, this is the least of degrees. So that we don't make them ask. So if we make someone ask us for something, then we haven't reached a special degree of brotherhood yet. And still it's good if we're asked to give. And then there's degrees after that. But this is what Hujjat al-Islam says here. And then he mentions these beautiful stories about how people were. That he says that one of them that would have one izar, which is a wraparound, what you wrap around your waist, and that he would divide it in two and give part of it to his brother and part of it that he would keep. And the Sahaba, they lived like this. Many of Ahl al-Sufa, is that when you hear these descriptions of the clothing that they wore, is that if they covered their bottom half, that their top half would show. And they couldn't cover their top half because then their bottom half would show. That Mus'ab bin Umair is that gave out so much of his wealth, by the time he passed, his shroud wouldn't cover his body fully. Is that if you pulled it up, his toes would show. If you pulled it down, that his head would show. What kind of sacrifice did these people make? The second level, which is higher now, in tunzidu manzilata nafsak, is that you treat him the way you would treat your own self in relation to your wealth. وَتَرْضَى بِمُشَارِكَةِ إِيَّاكَ فِي مَالِكَ, and that you that are content to have him share in your wealth and that use it the way that you would use it for your own self in the highest degree. And tu'thiruha nafsik, is that you even prefer him over your own self, to the extent that you put his need before your need. And he says, هَذَا رُتْبَةَ الصِّدِّقِينَ. This is the degree of those who are that close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the highest saints. وَمُنْتَهَى الدَّرَجَاتِ الْمُتَحَابِّينَ, and the highest degree of those who love each other for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. وَمِن تَمَامْ هَذِهِ رُتْبَةِ الْإِثَارِ بِالنَّفْسِ أَيْضًا. So not just with your wealth. From the completion of this stage is that you would even sacrifice your soul. This is the completion of this highest of degrees. And he mentions this beautiful story of Abu Hussein al-Nuri, is that during his time that one of the Khulafa is that issued an edict that all of them were to be executed, he and his companions. So they're all brought, and that in those days there was a sayyaf, is the one who that bears the sword and chops the head off. And so as they're being all brought forward, is that he put himself to have his head chopped off first, right? And then they notice this, like who in their right mind would ever do something like that? He says that, I preferred in this moment to that go first so that my brothers could live a little bit longer. And then when they witness this, it was like, what kind of people are these? And actually, it was a means for them eventually to be pardoned. فَكَانَ سَبَبْ نَجَاةِ جَمِيعِهِمْ فِي حِكَايَةٍ طَوِيلٍ. It's a long story, but they said that it was a means for all of them to live. Now, and so he says, فَإِنْ لَمْ تُصَادِفْ نَفْسَكَ فِي رُتْبَ هَذِهِ رُتَبْ مَعَ أَخِيكَ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ عَقْدَ الْأُخُوَّةِ لَمْ يَنْعَقِدْ بَعْدَ فِي الْبَاطِنِ وَإِنَّمَا الْجَارِ بَيْنِكُمَا مُخَالَطَةٌ رَسْمِيَّةٌ. He says that if we haven't that reached this state, then he says that no, that we haven't that tasted anything of that true brotherhood. We'll just translate it very generally. But you just have kind of an official form of a friendship of some sort with someone. Mukhalata, you're mixing with them, spending time with them. There's some degree of friendship or fellowship, but it's not brotherhood, religious, spiritual brotherhood. No. And he says that then he warns us here that someone who is in this particular state is that you want to be very careful to have that worldly dealings with them. And that, so he quotes that someone by the name of Abu Hazm, إِذَا كَانَ لَكْ أَخٌ فِي اللَّهِ فَلَا تُعَامِلْهُ فِي أُمُورِ دُنْيَاكَ. Is if you have a brother for the sake of Allah, then don't have any worldly dealings with that person. And this is from wisdom. And there are some people that would warn of that. Imam al-Ghazali rationalized this by saying, what he means are those that are in this degree. And so in general, that we want people to have dealings with one another, but unfortunately sometimes is that people aren't mature enough, or they don't have the traits that are necessary to actually have interactions in dealings, especially financial, with other people. So sometimes there's a wisdom, and that not doing certain things with certain people, not going into business, for instance, with certain people. And then you have to be careful. And that when you choose your business partners and things of this nature. So this is just to point this out. He says, as for this highest degree, this is how Allah Ta'ala describes the true believers. And this is where they prefer others over themselves. He mentions a wealth of stories here. Someone came to Abu Hurairah. Abu Hurairah spent a lot of time that towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ with the best of creation. He said, Inni urid an u'akhiyak fillah. I want to take you as a brother for the sake of Allah. And then he looked at him and says, Atadri ma haqqul ikha? Do you know what the right of brotherhood is? He says, Arifni, tell me what it is. Ala takuna ahaq bi dinarak wa dirhamak minni. Is that you don't have more right to your money, your gold and silver coins, than I do. And then the Imam said, Lam ablugh hadhihi manzila ba'd. I haven't reached this degree yet. قال فاذهب عني. Then he says, then we can't have a brotherhood essentially. وهكذا. And then Sayyidina Ali ibn Hussein is that the great grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. سأل هل يدخل أحدهم يده في كم أخيه أو كيسه فيأخذ من ما يريد بغير إذن? Is that do any of you put his hand in the keys, is really like the pouch. This is where they used to keep money. That in the sleeve or the pocket or the pouch of their brother and take whatever they want without asking? They said, La. قال فلستم بإخوان. He says that you're not really brothers. And the purpose of this is not to just beat us down, to tell us how terrible we are. But the point is to let us know that the people before us is at what level they were at. And we have to obviously put this into practice in a balanced fashion, and that at least know where we're at. This is what's important. Know where we're at. And this is the thing, is that, you know, I can use the analogy of family. Growing up as a non-Muslim in this country and experiencing that a certain different types of families, is that even the family, and this is a general statement, but there's truth in it, I believe wholeheartedly, even the families of non-practicing Muslims are so superior to the vast majority of the existing families in the United States of America, or the remnants of family, if you can even call it a family, that there's no comparison. There's no comparison, let alone that good practicing families that are very much intact. There is no comparison. And so the thing is that even the remnants of what we have of brotherhood and community is so superior to what other people have, or really what they don't have. Is that the point here is that we have to understand where we're at. When we speak about the maqamat of the deen, the various stations of the religion, if we're really 2 out of 9, we need to know that. So we need to know, if we're at 2, okay, how can I get to 3? And then if we're at 3, how can I get to 4? So if we would talk about a breakdown of brotherhood in a similar sense, where am I at? And what do I need to work on in my own self first and foremost, so I can have a higher degree of quality of relationship? That's really one of the big take-homes that you and I can really bring home with ourselves after this weekend. Because when we talk about companionship, we tend to be thinking about another person. But if you don't have something, you can't give something. An empty vessel can't give. Is that we have to think about our own selves first and foremost. And the same thing applies for a marriage. And the same thing applies as well as having children. Is that good parenting begins with the parent, his or herself. That a good marital relationship begins with that you as a spouse in and of yourself, and so forth and so on. So this is essentially what he says about the first duty, which is in relation to our wealth. And then the second one, it's also another type of assistance, but now it's an i'ana bin nafs. It's personal assistance. You in and of yourself are helping them. And specifically to do what? في قضاء الحاجات. To fulfill their needs, taking care of their needs. والقيام بها قبل السواب. But again, trying to do this before they even ask. وتقديمها على الحاجات الخاصة. And even putting them before some of your own needs. So he says that just as there's degrees of giving out our wealth in relation to our fellow companion, likewise the same thing goes with that assisting them personally. So what is the least of degrees here? He says, القيام بالحاجة عند السؤال والقدرة ولكن مع البشاشة والاستبشار. Is that when someone asks and you have the ability to actually do it, is that you take care of that person's need. But at least with that a smile on your face and happiness in your heart. وإظهار الفرح وقبول المنة. He's very detailed. Is that you show that you're happy to do this, and you realize is that he's doing you a favor and you're not doing him a favor by taking care of the need. Ajib. Is that this is the way these people are. This is how they are before their Lord. Is that if they ever saw someone that was in need of money, is that they didn't see themselves as the one who was on top. And Imam al-Ghazali even mentions that the adab is that if you ever give someone, try to give something like this so that people grab it from you as opposed to giving it like this. So that then you feel that you're somehow on top, and then, no, you give it like this, humbly. And you realize that when they take it for you, if possible, if people still give in this particular way, is that it is a blessing upon you that there are people that will take from what you need to give in order to draw near to Allah Ta'ala. These are beautiful internal etiquettes. And then he quotes this beautiful statement of Imam Ja'far Muhammad, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. And he says, إِنِّي لَأَتَّصَارِ إِلَى قَضَاء حَوَائِجْ أَعْدَائِي مخافة أن أردهم فيستغنوا عني. Is that I do whatever I can to quickly take care of the needs of my enemies, in fear is that I will that repel them and that they will be in no need of me. And he says, if this is what the a'da, what about the asdiqa? If this is with our enemies, then what about our friends? And here enemies, maybe not in the way that readily comes to the mind, is that people that have ill will for you, people that speak ill of you, something of this nature, people that don't tend to like you, is that this is the way these people are. Is that even if people have a false perspective about you, speak ill of you, these are people that will do whatever they can, that publicly and privately, to take care of the needs of people. And that I know that some of our teachers, is that there's people that might even speak ill of them publicly, but behind the scenes, is that they're giving them that a regular stipend of money of things that they need on a regular basis, and they're speaking ill of them publicly. SubhanAllah. And what a blessing, right? That Allah gives you the opportunity to show ikhlas, where that you're not going to be praised for what you're doing. There's people speaking against you, but if you really want to do something for the sake of Allah, then khalas. That this is an opportunity, if that ever arises. And it's similar to when you're serving in some capacity and you're doing everything that you can to serve, and you recognize that you fall short in it. And then the criticism and the layers of criticism. And this person says this and this person says that. And no matter what it is that you do, but then, but they could have done this, or this could have happened, and no matter which, why don't they offer that? And then that at first it gets heavy on you. You're like, subhanAllah. You're trying to do what it is that you can. We're only people to know that the back end and the limited human and financial resources. But then you recognize, and this is from the barakah of the shuyukh, is that these are opportunities to be fully sincere with Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. If we're doing this work for Allah and Allah only, we will be totally disconnected from both the dham and the madih, the one who criticizes as well as the one who praises. The nature of the nafs is that we feel more motivated when people praise us, but that means we have something to work on. Is that we should be similarly motivated whether there is criticism or whether there is praise, to do what it is that we do for His sake. And Allah gives us these opportunities so that we can, again, ultimately be solely for Him. Tabarak wa ta'ala. He mentions this beautiful story. وَكَانَ فِي الصَّرَفْ مَنْ يَتَّفَقَّرِ إِلَى أَخِيهِ, that وَلَدَ بَعْدَ مَوْتِ 40 سَنَةً. You find stories amongst the Salaf where someone had a brother for the sake of Allah, is that the husband passed away and he took care of the family and the children of his brother for 40 years. That taking care of their needs for 40 years. SubhanAllah. And again, if we can't do all of this, we should at least try to do what we can. And then he says that وَبِالْجُمْلَ فَيَنْبَغِي أَن تَكُونَ حَاجَةُ أَخِيكَ مِثْلَ حَاجَتَكَ. So this is now another degree. The least degree is that when they ask, when it comes to taking care of needs. The second degree is that their needs are like our own needs. But really it should be more important. And that when تكون متفقد لأوقات الحاجة غير غافل عن أحواله, is that we should be asking regularly about people, how they are. And not just from people themselves, but from other people. How so-and-so? Is so-and-so okay? Like your friend or your brother might not tell you fully, but you ask other people about them. How's so-and-so doing? Is everything okay? Do they need anything? In other words, is that look at what our deen is trying to create. Imagine if you have a community of people, everybody's asking for each other. Part of the problem is people aren't praying in congregation in the musalla or the masjid the way they should be. Because if they were, then you would definitely know to ask about them, because you don't see them for a day or two. Are they okay? Right? That's one of the great wisdoms of the Jumu'ah prayer, of the 5 daily prayers, of the various munasabat and the things that we do throughout the year. But that's a separate issue. But in general, we should ask about people to the extent possible. And ultimately, one person can only do so many things that as community grows. But this is why you need a group of people to all do the same thing. that being a community member is not a passive thing where you come and just suck up the benefit. That the ideal is that when you come to be a part of a community, it's an active role of service. Is that you are coming to, yes, benefit from everything that the community has to offer, but most importantly, you come to serve. How can I serve? How can I help? And that what gap can I fill? What role that can I do that no one else is able to do? And so then he says, so don't be heedless about his states the way you're not heedless about your own states. And then he says, وَلَا تَرَى لِنَفْسَكَ حَقًّا بِسَبَبْ قِيَامِكَ بِهَا. Don't see yourself as having a right over that person because of some good that you've done for them. This is very easy, that in the nafs, you do something good for someone, it's like, okay, now you can almost like control this person. This person's indebted to me, and I expect this person to act and treat me or do this thing for me. Right? That's all from the nafs. That if we're doing it for Allah, we don't have those expectations. And it arises when there's criticism. And so there's ways of testing ourselves to see how it is that we are. What we really want to do is إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. We are feeding you for the noble accountants of Allah. لا نريد منكم جزاء ولا شكورا. We don't want, this is Quran, any recompense from you or to even be thanked. Now people surely should thank. That's their job, but we shouldn't want to be thanked. And that we should just give freely, that do actions freely, solely for the sake of Allah Tabaraka. But then this is how you become free as a human being. Is that when you sever that the connections that we have from that people that treat us in different ways, is that as long as we are that excessively worried about what people think, we're caged in and we will suffer psychologically and spiritually as a result. Our deen teaches us to rise up above all of that. And of course, this requires maturity and it has to be cultivated in the heart. So then he says, وَلَا يَنْبَغِي, and this could be considered to be a third degree, although he doesn't present it like this, that وَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَن تَقْتَصِرَ عَلَى قَضَاءِ الْحَاجَةِ, that you shouldn't limit yourself to just taking care of the need. بَلْ تَجْتَهِدْ فِي الْبِدَايَةِ بِالْإِكْرَامِ فِي الزِّيَادَةِ, is that you should take care from the beginning of even more than what the need is. Subhanallah. Allahu Akbar. Allahumma salli ala. So Ata one time said, تَفَقَّدُوا إِخْوَانُكُمْ بَعْدَ ثَلَاثٍ. After 3 days, if you haven't seen your brother, ask about them. فَإِنْ كَانُوا مَرْضَى فَعُدُوهُمْ, that if they're sick, visit them. أَوْ مَشَاغِيلٍ فَعِينُوهُمْ, if they're busy, help them. أَوْ كَانُوا نَسَوْا فَذَكِّرُوهُمْ, if they've somehow forgotten, then remind them. And then he gets to these next two duties that relate to the tongue. And while all of these are very important, these two are from the most important because of the way that so many relationships are destroyed with the movement of the tongue. Saying things that we shouldn't say, or not having the courage to say things that we should say. And so that he says the third duty relates to the tongue, and he says here, بِالسُّكُوتِ مَرَّ بِمَنُّطْ أُخْرَى. There's ukhra. There are times that we should say things, and there's times that we should that guard our tongues. And so he says, فَهُوَ أَنْ يَسْكُتَ عَنْ ذِكْرِ عُيُوبِهِ فِي حَضْرَةِ وَغَيْبَتِهِ. One should that yaskut, refrain, yani not talk, remain silent, and not mention his faults in his presence or in his absence. بَلْ يَتَجَاهَلُ عَنْهُ. This form tafa'ala means to that act as if that you don't know that it's there. To pretend in a good way, this is a good type of pretending, that you are unaware of it. And there's what's called taghaful. There are certain things, this is a very important part of parenting, in fact, is that knowing what to address and knowing what to overlook, just as it's a very important part of community building. Knowing what issues to address and hit head on, and know what issues to just kind of not focus on. وَيَسْكُتْ عَنَ رَدْ عَلَيْهِ فِي مَا يَتَكَلَّمْ بِهِ. And that you don't act contrarian, essentially is what he's saying. Is that if there's certain people that no matter what it is that you say, yeah, but, you say this, yeah, but, and it's just a constant, like, you can't say anything without them saying something else. And it's just like, dude, I'm not even going to speak because I'm going to say something, you're going to like say the opposite, right? And that's really like the devil's advocate. The angel advocate, yeah, and he might point sometimes to other things that you need to hear. But just being contrarian, and that no matter what it is that someone says, that you just say something different. And unfortunately, there's some people who that learn and even read about, you know, ways of being, and there's all these, some of these titles, these even books that are out there, I always feel are really strange. Just, it's really demonic. And that it's kind of rooted in, you know, this attempt of this, oftentimes it's in relation to men and that warped sense of that toxic masculinity, or that power, or that having to control or even manipulate people. There's unfortunately people who that read a lot of this stuff and that carry themselves in a certain way. And this is precisely what our Prophet ﷺ is warning us against. When he says, "La khayra fi man la ya'laf wa la yu'laf." There's no good in someone who does not befriend other people or allow himself to be befriended. Now, certainly, that unfortunately, that in a place like the United States of America, there are certain places that people live that are so toxic and so difficult, but that people have to keep up their defense systems constantly because of how many times that they've been burned. And that we, of course, have principles that we deal with when it comes to those things. So that we don't want to approach this in an immature way, but nor do we want to approach these topics in that naive side of it. Put everything in its proper place. But in general, is that we shouldn't be contrarian. Is that just because someone says something that we say something else? And part of this is, now this is first about what you guard the tongue against, is وَأَنْ يَسْكُتَ عَنْ أَسْرَارِهِ الَّتِي بَثَّهَا إِلَيْهِ. Be very careful to divulge the secrets of your friends. Is that when you have close friends, there are certain things that you tell them. And that this is very important that we not divulge people's secrets. So many problems in the community arise from this. Is that someone opens up to you about something and they need help with something, or there's something that's bothering them, or that there's just something that is important to them that they share with you. And then someone just speaks about it. And then someone else just speaks about it. And everybody who speaks about it thinks that they're only going to speak about it to that one special close person to them, and all of a sudden, everybody knows about it. And so this is something that we want to be careful of. And then also too, is that we shouldn't be critical of anyone that is also that beloved to that person. We shouldn't be critical of their family. We shouldn't be critical of their children. Now, this doesn't mean advice. The advice portion is coming in this next one. And this was the way of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يواجه أحدا بشيء يكرهه. As we know in the description of Shamal and the Shamal al-Tirmidhi, our Prophet ﷺ would not that speak to someone in a way that they disliked, or that face someone with something that they disliked. Now, this didn't mean that he didn't advise. He would advise people when he saw that there was mistakes. But to the extent possible, he ﷺ would only speak to people in a way that uplifted them. And Imam al-Ghazali says the exception here is when you hear people that have said good things about that person. He said to conceal this, usually this is from envy in your heart. That if you know that there was someone who said something good about someone, you're actually supposed to convey that. Just as both Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Umar conveyed the praise of the Prophet Sayyidina Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, that from his recitation of the Quran. So this is a good thing, is that when we convey the good of what people that have said, but we want to refrain from even mentioning their faults. And then he gives us a way to understand this, because he wants us to know that all of us have faults. And the same things that other people are struggling with are the same things that we're struggling with in relation to other things. So we have to have compassion. And then that if we wanted to ever have a companion that had no fault whatsoever, he said, you're going to live your life lonely. You're going to live alone. You're not going to have any friends. Because everybody has faults. Everybody has faults. And then there's degrees, and I'm hoping we can go into a little bit more detail, because we didn't really cover this last night. But in the interactive sections, I'm actually going to begin with this in both the men's and the women's. There's degrees to which, when we talk about hating for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we go about addressing certain wrongs with different people in general. But then there are certain rules that apply to your brothers, and then there's different ways of the Salaf, even in relation to that. There's different paths that they had. So it's important that we have this general knowledge of it. And then Imam al-Ghazali gives us these incredibly beautiful principles to make sure that we're that we're doing something that is acceptable, while putting our lower self into question and trying to do what is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it gets a little bit detailed, but what he says on that topic is extremely important. And so knowing this is that the Kareem, the noble person, is the one that focuses on the good that's in his companion. And then he covers their faults. The La'im, the ignoble person, is the one that focuses on the bad that's in someone and covers their good. It's the opposite. And Ibn Mubarak said, Al-Mutmin yatlab al-ma'adhir. The believer looks for excuses. The munafiq yatlab al-atharat. The hypocrite is the one who looks for people's faults and literally where they slip up. Everybody slips up in one way or another. Something is that they say, something is that they do. The munafiq is the one who looks for that. And that, unfortunately, that there's a lot of people who do that. Al-Fudayl Miyad said, Al-Futuwa, chivalry is what? As-Safhu an Zallat al-Ikhwan. Is that looking, that pardoning, and that the slip-ups of your brothers. And so everybody has various faults. And so that we need to then know that when we build relationships from Allah, the bounty of Allah Ta'ala, is that if we have too high of expectations, we are going to be left that without any friends or companions at all. So I need to get to this last bit here. And again, he has a very important section here about what that means, satar al-awra, covering someone's faults. And did that happen just one time, or has it happened multiple times? Is it something that just relates to him, or is it something that has that community impact? All of these situations are different. And unfortunately now it's just in this cancel call-out culture, it's just completely black and white, when actually it's very nuanced. It's actually very nuanced. And there are certainly times where there's sitar. You're not supposed to talk about these things. And then even one of the wisdoms that is that even talking about these things, unless there's really a need to do so, subtly incites people to do them. That's one of the wisdoms, because the more people talk about fawahish, acts of indecency, the more people are emboldened to actually do them. And that this also doesn't mean, as well, is that if someone is continuing to do something wrong, that you cover them up. No, sometimes is that part of being a good brother there is that making sure that they don't do that wrong anymore. So there's a lot of details there. that we're unfortunately not going to be able to get into right now, but it relates to this topic. So the last thing that he then says here is about what are the things that we should actually say. And he says that there are certainly that times when we should speak when it's beneficial. And he says that فَعَلَيْنِ يَتَوَدَّدْ إِلَيْهِ بِلِسَانِهِ. We should that say words that engender love. Speak in a way that brings the hearts together. That we should ask about him. Is that we should that ask and see how things are going. And that we should that let them know that we're thinking about them. So that if you go to Ummah, and I'm a person who doesn't like pictures, but sometimes it's like you know that taking a picture with this person is going to make someone happy. And there's ikhtilaf about pictures, so you take a picture and send it to them to make people happy. Or you send them a text and be like, hey, I'm just thinking about you. Or I just made dua for you here. Little things like this, Allah, they do wonders in bringing the hearts together. And so using the tongue in this way, and even as our Prophet said, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, is that إِذَا حَبَّ أَحَدُكُمْ أَخَاهُ فَلْيُخْبِرْهُ. If you love your brother, then tell him, I love you. SubhanAllah, what a blessing to tell people you love them. And that for some people, when they first become Muslim, it's a little bit strange. Like hugging so many like men and like so many people telling you they love you, like, dang, like I'm not really used to that. You don't really know me. How do you love me? But this is the strength of the belief in Islam. Is that look what it does. Is that people that you've never even met, that you just hear about, then you come to genuinely love them for Allah. And then you see them, you should tell them, I love you. Right? What a blessing. And this is sunnah. That Prophet ﷺ said to Sayyidina Mu'adh, Ya Mu'adh, Sayyidina Amjad quoted already, Inni la uhibbuk. I love you. He heard this from who? The best of creation, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And then from among those things is to what? And tad'uhu bi'ahabbi asma'i ilayhi fi ghaibati hudurih. Is that you only speak about them in a respectful way. Yani literally, you call them by the most beloved names to them. In their presence, and even when they're not there. So in their presence, you say one thing, and behind their back, nah. Even you know that they like to be called a certain way, you call them by those names. And tuthni alayhi bima ta'rif min mahasin ahwali indama yu'thar huwa thana anhu. Is that you speak highly of them. And not just them. You speak highly of their children and their family, what it is that they do, and so forth and so on. He says, he goes into all these, ala aqlihi wa khalqihi wa hayatihi wa khattihi wa shi'rihi wa tasnifihi wa jami' ma yafrah bih. All these different things that pertain to the individual. Is that how he dresses, how he even writes, and if he composes poetry, and so forth and so on. And then, وَأَن تَشْكُرَ عَلَى صَنِيعِهِ, you thank him with your tongue as well. And then you protect his honor when he is not there. And then the last thing he mentions here in the use of the tongue is at-ta'lim al-nasiha. Is that when the time is right and in the right way, you also advise them. And that having a brother for the sake of Allah doesn't mean that you advise them when the time is right in that proper way. That's about as much as we've covered. We've already gone over 5 minutes. So we did our best to, this is one of the longer books. I think this is like the 5th longest book of the Ahad. It's like 240 pages in this edition that we use. So it's a very long book. We're unable to cover everything throughout the weekend, but we're trying to bring out the most important things. So may Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq, Ya Rab, and that bless us to be people who recognize the importance of these duties, but then do our best to fulfill them, and to be people that develop great traits of character, that are weighty in the scales, and that people of integrity, people of magnanimity, and may we be people that are noble in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and do what is right in relation to His creation, and all of the good character traits that our Prophet had, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah tabarak wa ta'ala bless us with a share of them, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. So if there are any questions, please do just keep them. We will have time, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, in the interactive session to get to them Barakallahu feekum. Wasamihuna for going over time. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Alhamdulillah.